I'm really excited to talk to you. I was just saying before we started recording that I saw you at a meeting we were both at years ago. It's very, I remember you very clearly because you spoke so strongly about a number of issues, and we're going to get into some of those issues. But let's just start out for people who aren't familiar with your work.
Sure.
Just give us an overview of FarmSTAND and kind of the theory of change there, and then we'll get into detail. And particular emphasizing that point that I just made, which I find it very unusual for an organization dealing with farming to be worried both about the animals and the people.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I do. I think that we feel strongly about that. We existed for over a decade, as like you said, as part of a larger organization, and we just kept seeing the need grow and grow, which is why we started FarmStand as an independent organization. We just really didn't see any other legal advocacy group that, rather than focusing on a corner of the web of the harms that industrial animal agriculture is creating, which we believe are the worst harms, we're focusing on what is allowing that web to exist itself. And I think, not only do we feel that, that's kind of morally and ethically right to care for the planet and wildlife and farm animals and workers and eaters, but we also think it is strategic, right? By not taking kind of a corner of the web, it's really allowed us to build power across all these different areas. We care very deeply about the animals, but by not saying we are here for animals, it allows us to represent animal farmers, because they are both trapped in the same system. And, not saying like we're only here for workers, it allows us to represent communities impacted by the places that those people are working in. And what we have found is, we bring lawsuits that represent workers and animal welfare groups and communities all in one case. Then they start talking, then they form trusting relationships. Ultimately, that helps us build power against, a really powerful industry that wants to divide us. So, we're really excited to be an organization that's just really solely focused on uniting all of these different, uh, people and animals and advocates who are impacted by this system.
And it's such important work. And I mean, I think there's more recognition within the animal protection movement that this is really necessary. But it's always been tough, and it is tough because the animal protection movement has always had difficulties partnering with other groups that are victims of the same system. And those groups may not necessarily have the animals in mind because most people in the world don't have the animals in mind. I mean, we're a tiny little tight little group.
Yeah.
And that includes workers' rights groups and environmental groups. And sometimes it's because of the rigidity of animal advocates who, like it's hard to work with people who eat animals. There's that problem, but it's also the problem that those other groups also have not wanted those partnerships.
That's
It's
right.
it's been on both sides. So how do you manage those conflicts and find that common ground that allow people to work together towards uh like fighting this industry that is so powerful that we cannot afford to fight it individually?
Yeah, I think we really focus on what we have in common, right? And that because the systems that are exploiting and harming animals are the exact same systems that are exploiting and harming workers. Um, you know, uh, there is a lot to focus on in common. And I get it with animal welfare and vegan activists. I think I became vegetarian when I was 12 in the early 90s. Um, there's just not a lot of people, right? Like, I was definitely picked on for that, and I wanted to find my people, and when I did, I felt this huge sense of relief. I think that there's this great draw to wear the animal's hat, right? Because so many other spaces ignore that, and so it's just this deep call, and I think that there should be advocates doing that. I think the problem happens when you have a group that maybe a lot of their members are farmers that raise animals, either in part or in whole. and then they see that as a threat. And so I think what we've really been able to do is just take this position that, you know, it's the corporations that are the problem. It's the way that they're behaving that is the problem. And nobody can disagree with that. And so that has really allowed us to at least bring people to the table. And when people do come to the table, I think that they find they have a lot more in common than they thought. But our experience generally has been that even where maybe there's been some distrust at first, working together has built trust across these movement spaces. And, they build lasting relationships, which is wonderful. Like this is our hope. Even outside of what we may be able to achieve in a courtroom, I think building that collective power is the real win.
Yeah, I really like the way you put that because I think we all do feel like nobody is speaking for the animals. And they'll people like to say, well, they're not really voiceless. They do talk up, but they're not talking in any courtrooms and in any spaces of power. So we're not going to do it. Who can do it? But that doesn't mean, I mean, people politics makes strange bedfellows. It's a very, very old point, and people have to get together in order to make change. So it's tough. And I think, I mentioned the other side that frequently, I think sometimes even more frequently, other like environmental groups and perhaps workers' rights groups, so I think that has been the weakest link in
Yeah.
in this whole world,
Yeah.
uh, have not wanted to work with the animal groups, but the animal groups have gotten more power. And so it's a little bit more attractive to like maybe find that advantage on for everyone. So I do see progress in that part in that space. And I think it's just a matter of being very, very careful in your communication of, what you agree with and putting aside the things you don't agree with and not ever feeling co-opted, which people just really don't want to have happen. And another thing that you've identified as part of the problem is this tendency. This is specifically in deciding what legal cases to bring. The tendency of animal welfare advocates to prioritize litigation against the worst corporate abusers. And it's pretty, the very worst of the abusers and abuses, like really focusing on the worst of the worst. And that's pretty standard for lawyers. You want to bring the cases you can win and that are the most dramatic. But you I think I read that you feel that this can lead to a false perception that animal abuse is like just the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
And there's a few bad actors, and the industry is always really, really happy to jump on board with we're horrified. We
Right.
fired them right away. And you really try to focus on this broad system of control. So how do you strategize legal litigation? How do you strategize the legal cases to
Yeah.
look at the broad system rather than finding like the horrific, horrific abuse that everybody's going to agree with? Oh yeah, that's terrible.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, I think that the folks who are doing the work exposing some of those worst abuses are doing critically important work. And I think, you were just talking about how, our movement has come a long way in terms of kind of connecting with worker justice groups and things like that. I think similarly, I've seen our movement come a long way in terms of, not focusing on like the person doing it and rather thinking about it as like, this is a system that allows for that. This is a system that causes that. Because, for at FarmSTAND, we really see this as the work of liberation, right? For animals, for people, for the planet, and none of us can be free while this system is still controlling, the means of production there. That's a moral belief, of course, but I think it is deeply strategic. And so when we're looking at litigation, we are saying like, what is it about the world that we want to change? It isn't that we want to punish somebody who's being horrifically oppressed, being put in this system where they are doing terrible things to animals. What we want to change is that corporation that is oppressing workers, that's hiring them in those scenarios, that is encouraging that kind of behavior, that's putting profits above people and animals and the environment. And so I think a lot like your podcast, you are like telling these stories. And what are the stories that you want to tell? That is what we're thinking about with our litigation. It's, what are the rules and systems that we want to change? But it's also, what is the story that we are telling the world about this? And, we really that story needs to be focused on that collective liberation piece and not on, one worst case scenario. We need to see this as a system and not a one off.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting because I've been talking about uh, uh, legal advocacy and how we need, how there are science educators, are they called, or like like people who translate science
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
other people. We need the same thing for law because every lawsuit is a story with heroes and villains and drama, and it gets lost in all of
I
our
agree.
Latin phrases and bullshit.